Good evening.
Thank you, Cheryl. Now we can get them all to say good evening.
Good evening.
Yes, yes. I'm so pleased to see so many of you out here. We were worried about this timing. It's an odd time for us to be doing a talk, squeezing it in between the many commitments that people have on a Sunday evening. So thank you, students and colleagues, for coming out tonight for this very important talk. My name is Patrice Franco, and I'm the director of the Goldfarb Center and professor of economics and global studies. And it is my honor to welcome you, to introduce our new year in the Goldfarb Center, and to introduce and very much welcome our honored guest, Dr. Michener. For this academic year, the Goldfarb theme, which will culminate in the Goldfarb Freedom of Expression Symposium. For those of you who are new to our community, in the spring we have what we call GFES, which is an opportunity by promoting a public policy idea this year on the theme of inequality to win up to $2,000 for your good ideas. So you'll be hearing more about all of that, but tonight's lecture is in this theme and kicking off this important work that we're doing on the causes and consequences of inequality. What role does past and present racism play in perpetrating economic inequality? And how might this be redressed? Can we imagine a new social contract? Rather than deepening inequality, can technology be an accelerator of inclusive growth? Is basic guaranteed income an answer? We're working hard on a Cotter debate on that. What directions might inclusive growth take in the Waterville area? These are some of the questions that we will interrogate this year. And I was delighted when my brilliant colleague, Professor Levan, Carrie, if you would just stand up so people can see you. Yes. Carrie is this year's Associate Director of the Goldfarb Center. She suggested that Professor Jamila Michener could kick off our work this year. Professor Michener comes from the Department of Government at Cornell University to help us understand the politics of poverty, race, and public policy in the United States. She asks important, pointed questions and provides startling systemic answers. What happens when we drug test for Medicaid? Well, she argues drug testing jeopardizes our social contract. For the more than 70 million Americans who rely on Medicaid, state-run programs like Wisconsin's Badger Care are their closest contact with the state, and drug testing distances them and others from perceiving their full rights as citizens. What can we expect with the implementation of work requirements for programs such as SNAP in welfare assistance? Michener's powerful research suggests that programs threaten the very fabric of our democracy. In her book, Fragmented Democracy, Medicaid, Federalism, and Unequal Politics, she notes, punitive policies like work requirements tell beneficiaries that they have little power, are not trusted, will not be heard, and cannot count on the government for help in times of need. Having learned such lessons, beneficiaries lose faith in government, forego opportunities to vote, and disengage from politics more broadly. The answers to these and many tough questions she asks are grounded in fact. Professor Michener's beautifully written and empirically rich papers show us a path to greater equality. Her work demonstrates geographical patterns of political disengagement, shows gaps are most pronounced where states have reduced benefits. Inequality isn't random for Michener. Instead, she tells us the social, economic, and political significance of where a person lives stems from public policies that create, contour, and reinforce systemic inequity. As she eloquently puts it, the concentration of disadvantage occurs when people who lack significant resources and or who bear substantial burdens clustered together in particular communities. Professor Michener's research has found support among the most prestigious funders: the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, Russell Sage, National Science Foundation, Robert Woods Johnson Institute for Research on Poverty, and the Ford Foundation. She's an engaged scholar. She co-leads the Finger Lakes chapter of the Scholars Strategy Network, an organization bringing academic research to policymakers. And P.S. to my faculty colleagues in this room, Carrie and I will be exploring this opportunity for faculty here at Colby this year. She serves on the advisory board of the Cornell Prison Education Program and teaches in local correctional facilities. Prior to working at Cornell, she was a Robert Wood Johnson Health Policy Scholar at the University at Michigan. Her PhD from the University of Chicago, an undergraduate degree from Princeton, prepared her to bring her important questions to our national debate. We are sure that Professor Michener will provoke thoughtful conversation tonight. I hope that you all ask questions as tough and insightful as she posits in her work. Following her presentation, we'll have a Q&A where we invite you to introduce yourself and provide reactions to her talk. We also encourage you to tweet your thoughts. This is going to be a little bit new for Gold Farm. But we want to be able to track, to pick up what you're thinking about, the gaps where something that she says maybe doesn't sit right for you, or maybe you just want to push something a little bit further. So I edited your slide just a little bit. Dr. Michener's, her own handle is @PovertyScholar. If you would hashtag Colby College and also put the tag Gold Farm Center and Poverty Scholar if you have some of these ideas that you'd like to share. Also on the way out, I'll have a little folder where I encourage you to drop your name and email address. We're hoping that this is the first of many different ways that we can think about inequality this semester. I know much of this is also taking place within the student affairs side of the college with our dean on diversity and inclusion, with the Pew Center, with the PCB. We want to collaborate. We want to figure out ways that this year, together with partnerships, we can recreate our culture at Colby. So please join me in thanking Professor Michener for making this trip from Ithaca to Waterville and helping us understand the structural dynamics contributing to widening inequality and weakening belief in our democratic institutions. Thank you.
All right. Okay, good. I don't need to time myself. There's a timer here. All right. Fair warning that my kids made me sick, so if I have to stop and blow my nose, I apologize in advance for grossing you out. That was an amazing introduction, and it's actually, the better an introduction is, the more intimidated I am, because I'm like, no, don't set the bar so high. Set it nice and low so I know I can overcome it. But I'm happy to be here, and I'm happy to see this room this full on a Sunday night. I really admire the fact that all of you are here. I know generally on a Sunday night, I'm like in sweatpants hanging out with my kids. So the fact that you all managed to drag yourself out is really impressive. I think it speaks to the appetite for conversations about race and inequality on campus, and that's a good sign. I think it's a good place to start, wanting to actually talk about these topics, even though they're difficult, right? So I appreciate being here. I've been here for most of the day, and I've just enjoyed this place. It's really beautiful. And it's made me think about, it's made me think a lot about the United States, which is a place that I think is really beautiful. And I always say this before I give a talk about race, because I think that the way that a lot of people can interpret a talk about race is, now we're trotting out all of the things that are terrible about this country and about our history and about our present, and it's just this negativism, right? My parents are immigrants. They came here, they immigrated here in the 1970s from the Caribbean. because their economic opportunities were limited there. And they were looking for some place where their children could live a life that was better than the life they lived, right? My mom grew up, didn't finish high school, didn't finish primary school, picked cotton for most of her life in the Caribbean, and got here and worked low-wage jobs, cleaning people's offices for her whole entire life, right? Until she was fired when she was too old to find another job and just couldn't work anymore. And I'm a professor at Cornell. So obviously, there are opportunities for mobility here. And my parents, their hunch that coming here could be a good thing for their family was right. So it's impossible for me to be like all doom and gloom about the United States, right? And so when people say like, it sounds like you hate this country, I always say that's crazy, right? I love this place. And so all of the things that we'll delve into, some of which are difficult to think about or really confront, are coming from a place of love. Now you all are young, and so you may not know this yet, but any relationship, any loving relationship requires criticism, right? So I've been married for 15 years. I got married when I was really young. And you know, if all I did was just like smile at my husband, bat my eyes at him, and tell him how wonderful he was, let me tell you, not a lot of growth would happen. And if that's all he did to me, not a lot of growth would happen. But there are times when we've had to look at each other and say, look, here's what I see in you. And this piece isn't good. There's a whole bunch I love, but these pieces aren't good. And that's how we get better, right? So the takeaway here isn't to sort of whine and moan about all the terrible things. It's to confront the realities, both historical and contemporary, that shape our existence, right? They certainly shape my existence. And if you think that they don't shape your existence because you're not a person of color, you're wrong. All of us are living in this context. We're not all equitably shaped. We're not all shaped in the same ways. And all of us have to confront these difficulties, right? So we're going to talk about race. Talking about race is sometimes like a bummer, but we're just going to go for that. We're going to confront that because it matters, because it's important. Okay, and definitely tweet, because I think that's so cool that you all are encouraging that. All right, I want to start with the really basics. So apologies to the sociologists and other people in the room who have taken classes and who are going to know some of this stuff. But I want to assume that you don't know anything so that we can get ourselves on the same page so that we're talking about the same thing, right? Because sometimes I realize I think I'm talking about something, this is particularly with students, but really with anyone, and the audience is hearing something else. You're picking up something, but it's not what I'm putting down, right? So I just want to start on a note of clarity. What are we talking about when we talk about race? What is race? It's actually not as straightforward of a question as you might think. You know, one way of saying it is like, well, you know it when you see it. You see me up here, like, you know, I'm black. That's race, you know? I look out in this audience and I'm like, I have a sense of what these demographics are like, right? So in one way, it's really straightforward and it's not that complicated. But it is actually more complicated than it appears on the surface, right? Because race is a social classification system, not a biological one. It's a social classification system that's used to distinguish groups, usually based on phenotype, which is why you can look up here and, you know, I'm black, and that means something. It tracks to race, right? But the basis for the classification system has changed over time. In my graduate seminar that I teach on race, you know, we read documents from the Supreme Court that the court was producing in the 1960s, the 1950s, the 1970s, and they're trying to decide, are people who look white but who are Muslim and from Middle Eastern countries, are they white? And the court decides, nope, their religion makes them not white, right? And then we look at other things, and you know, when the court's trying to decide how to deal with people who come from China, you know, they're not black or brown, like do they count as white? Nope. Their cultural differentiation and language make them not white, right? So we may think you know it when you see it, but it's not actually that simple, because over time the criteria have changed and they continue to morph as we go along, because it's not really rooted in anything biological, it's a social system. So we change it based on the social functions it serves, which we'll talk about in a second. It's a historical and social construct. There was no race before the 16th century. That word did not mean the same thing it means to us now. The categorizations that we have did not exist then. Sure, if you saw somebody who was dark and you weren't dark, you noticed that, but it didn't have the social, political, economic factors attached to it that it does now, right? So, you know, wrongheadedly, we could think that race is just this like inherent biological essential thing that's been enduring for all of time, and that's just not how it's worked. It's a social and historical construct. Race doesn't have any biological basis. If a geneticist took my DNA and took some other random person in this room's DNA, and all they had were our DNA, and based on that they had to determine our race, the rate of error for determining race would be really high. It would be really high. One of the reasons for that is that genetic differences found within racial groups are more significant than the differences found between racial groups. 85% of all the genetic variation we've charted is within racial groups. Meaning that person sitting next to you, who looks a lot more like you than I do, might be very different, much more different from you genetically than I am, right? So it's not based in biology. Now, there are racial categories that correlate with biological traits, right? My hair is different, my skin is different, but these are generally superficial. And even when they're not superficial, so things like, you know, black people are more likely to have sickle cell, or certain groups of white people are more likely to have Tay-Sachs disease. So there's some other, like, below the surface correlations there, but they're just correlations, they're not deterministic. Meaning you can't say all black people X, all white people X. Well, partially because we made these things up, and we've developed them over time. They don't actually mean anything essential or inherent, right? We've known this since the 1940s. This is not anything new. Some of you are like, yawn, race is a social construct. I already know that. So why are we talking about race? Well, it's important to distinguish between a social fact and construct and some kind of real scientific thing. So a lot of times the takeaway that students get at the end of this is like, see, it's all fake. I knew it. So this black student on campus who keeps whining about race, like this isn't even a real thing. It doesn't even have any biological basis. Why do they keep talking about it, right? But it's a social fact. It's a social fact. Just keep, race is a social construct, race, my poor kids. I have a 6-year-old and a 9-year-old. They could stand up here and give this talk. That's how bad it is. I do feel bad for them sometimes, but most times not. Race is, so what does that mean? It's real. It's real in its operation. It's real in how it affects our lives, our economy, our politics, our communities, our interpersonal interactions, even without it having a biological basis. Isn't that incredible? Mm-hmm. We're constantly creating and recreating it and have been for a very long time. So it's just as real as anything else, even though it doesn't have a biological basis, right? I love this quote from Toni Morrison, the late now Toni Morrison. There's no such thing as race, none. Some people want to stop there. Woo! Praise Jesus, we don't have to talk about this thing anymore. This thing that makes me uncomfortable, get to ignore it. Toni Morrison said so, right? There's just a human race, so I don't see color. It's just we're all part of the human race. Isn't that what we love to say? I'm colorblind. Scientifically, anthropologically, racism is a construct, a social construct. It has a social function, right? And so the whole reason why the I don't see color thing doesn't work is because race is still operating. It still has a social function. And that's what we're going to talk about today. And in order to do that, I want to justify the approach that I'm going to take here, which is to focus on institutions, not people. So don't take this the wrong way. But I honestly could care less what is in any of your hearts and minds. If in your heart you're like thinking some racial epithet against me right now, that's kind of sad, but I care very little. That doesn't affect my life, right? And if in your heart and mind you are just the most wonderful, egalitarian person, I'm glad. Good job. It also doesn't necessarily affect my life. Right? Now, it can affect the lives of the people immediately around you because it affects how you engage with them, so it matters. But for our purposes today, let's say it doesn't matter as much as institutions matter. And so I'm going to talk about the ways that race operates institutionally and the consequences of that. Right? And it's kind of like the big picture view, and then we can think about how that filters down. But the institutions matter. Part of what that does is it gets us out of the fear that somebody is going to be called a racist, or that this is about identifying who the bad people are and who the good people are, and it's about identifying who the oppressed are and who the oppressors are, and where does that put most of the people who are in the room? Not on the good side of that ledger, which automatically puts us on the defense, right? Oh, now you're going to tell me about how my ancestors did terrible things and I'm terrible. Let's not do that, right? Instead, we focus on institutions. Of course, institutions operate on account of people, so eventually we get back to people. But the institutional view helps to give us a little distance, so we don't have to be defensive. We don't have to be like, no, not me, but I never did anything to you. And we can think about how systems operate. Because that's what matters for my life. That's what matters for your life, right? So really quickly, I want to play this.
I don't know what most white people in this country feel. I can only include what they feel from the state of their institutions. I don't know if white Christians hate Negroes or not, but I know that we have a Christian church which is white and a Christian church which is black. I know as Malcolm X once put it, that the most segregated hour in American life is high noon on Sunday. That says a great deal for me about a Christian nation. It means I can't afford to trust most white Christians and certainly cannot trust the Christian church. I don't know whether the labor unions and their bosses really hate me. That doesn't matter, but I know I'm not in their unions. I don't know if the real estate lobby is anything against black people, but I know the real estate lobbies keep me in the ghetto. I don't know if the Board of Education hates black people, but I know the textbooks they give my children to read and the schools that we have to go to. Now, this is the evidence. You want me to make an act of faith, risking myself, my wife, my woman, my sister, my children, on some idealism which you assure me exists in America, which I have never seen.
I think that's his name is Dick Cavett or something, the show host there. I don't think he was happy. He's like, oh gosh, this has gone off the rails. But that's James Baldwin in the 1970s, right? And what is Baldwin saying? I don't know what's in your heart and mind. I just know what I see. I know what I live. I know what institutions are producing, right? So that's why we're going to focus on institutions. So first, I want to talk about a couple of manifestations of racial inequality, and then we'll think about the institutional bases of these, right? So I'm going to go through pretty quickly, because then we're going to get to the meat, where we start thinking about where does some of this come from. Now, all of this is necessarily superficial, because you can't do this in 30 minutes, right? It's just a taste of starting to sort of shift how we think and understand how race operates institutionally in this country in particular, right? So this is the first disparity, poverty, right? And you can see these are poverty rates broken down by race. That green line is for Black Americans. The purple line afterwards is for what the Census Bureau calls Hispanic, or what now we often refer to as Latino Americans, and so on and so forth. Now, the white and the green and purple line are pretty far from the other lines. Now, that gap has declined over time, right? So it's not that nothing's getting better ever, but it's persisted even past the point where we might have thought, like, we're in this wonderful, like, post-racial place, right? There's still a really significant gap there. Let's think about education, right? If we look at levels of education completed by young adults, right, in the age group 25 to 29, high school, some college, bachelor's degree, and across those categories, and we can compare 1971 to 2017, right? So again, we can see change and we can see improvement, but we can also see continued disparity, right? We can see continued disparity. And in particular, we see that across every educational category. So education, even though we often think of it as the way to get out of racial inequality, that I'm going to come to an amazing school like Colby, and I'm going to get a great education, and it's just going to power me right out of these inequalities. But these inequalities persist even within educational brackets, right? Unemployment. I mean, the pattern is going to be the same. After a while, you're like, she's beating us over the head. But I'm just trying to make the point and make it clear, I'm not pulling these things out of thin air. There's just evidence on evidence on evidence on evidence of really vast racial disparities over time across groups, right? Income. Now, this is the other way around because higher up means higher income. So now we see Blacks and Latinos at the bottom, right? Wealth. Wealth is even more income. By measuring economic outcomes in terms of income, you're actually masking a lot of the deepest inequality. Because the deepest inequality is in terms of wealth. Why? We'll talk about this in a second. Wealth is intergenerational. Your wealth, your income, we could argue is just a function of you. Not really, right? Because whether your parents could afford to send you to college, et cetera, et cetera. But you could say it's largely a function of you. Your wealth is a function of generations, right? Whether you have that down payment to put on your house so that you can get a nicer, bigger house, a lot of people are getting that down payment from their parents. And how do their parents have the down payment? Because their parents helped them with it. And how their parents? Because their parents helped them with it. What does that mean? That means wealth develops and accumulates intergenerationally. So that even if something happened a long time ago, 4, 5, 6 generations ago, it's still affecting your wealth now. Which means the past isn't the past. It's the present. It's with us when it comes to wealth, right? And if we compare average family wealth by race, ethnicity over time, there's always been a wealth gap. It's actually growing. It's actually growing. So we may think everything's better. The civil rights movement happened. Martin Luther King, I have a dream. Contents of their character. Everything's okay now. Except wealth differentials are growing. And this is really significant. Some of you are young, so you may not know this yet. But wealth has a huge effect on your life. What you can do, where you can live, what neighborhood you live in, what home you can buy, what school your children can go to. A lot of these things are determined by access that you have to assets. And if you don't have those, it's going to affect the quality of your lives and the lives of the people around you. Home ownership, which is in part what's driving those wealth numbers, although not entirely, right? Same pattern. Rates of home ownership are highest among non-Hispanic whites, and then there's a big gap, and then everybody else. This is a different take on home ownership. These are mortgage denial rates. And now we see this flip. Black people are back up at the top again, whenever, and Latinos, whenever it's a disadvantage, we're at the top. Whenever it's an advantage, at the bottom, right? These are assets. Things that, like, you want to grow up and have. Some home equity, stocks and bonds, risky assets that, high risk, high return, right? IRAs, you all are young, you don't have to think about this yet necessarily. Guarantee you many of your parents are thinking about it if they're in a position that they can do so. One of the things that's interesting about this information is I looked at it within college or within educational brackets, right? Because you may think, well, look, maybe white people are just working harder. They're going to school, they're getting educations, and so of course they're less likely to be poor, and of course they have a higher income, and of course they have more wealth. Those things come from hard work and pulling yourself up. And so if you're working hard, you'll have these things. If you don't have these things, stop whining and complaining and saying it's because of race. Right. Except the returns on education, the return on that investment is not the same for everyone, right? So if you're in college, look at the risky assets, white, all the way at the top. Look at the home equity, all the way at the top. This is just for people in college. Stocks and bonds, all the way at the top. IRAs, all the way at the top. Now we've all gone to college, we're all working hard. We can look at numbers of hours worked, we can look at years of experience in the labor market, and we'll see the same thing. The return on your investment in terms of education, in terms of time, in terms of hours worked, in terms of experience, are dramatically lower if you're a person of color. It's not about hard work. One of the things I want to emphasize here is that in explaining all of this, institutions are a much more compelling explanation than evil villains, right? We just want to find evil villains. Oh, it's all President Trump's fault. Or President fill in the blank. Now, I'm not saying that none of these folks have various forms of responsibility, and in fact, you never know what's going to come out. In fact, they're part and parcel of institutions, right? They're part of institutions. So it's not as though, oh, nobody has any responsibility. But it's much more productive to focus on institutions, right? This is a quote from a political scientist at University of Michigan, and Lynn and David Harris, a sociologist. They have this great book on race and poverty. One of the things they say is that government policies are shapeable decision-making. As a result, our institutions, practices, beliefs can foster racial disadvantage without any deliberate effort to discriminate. You don't need a bad guy, even though a student called me out recently for saying bad guy. Are only guys bad? You don't need a bad person, right? You don't need an evil person smoking the cigarette in the back of the room plotting how to bring all black people down in order to perpetuate these systems. You don't need it. That's not to say that those people aren't out there. But with or without them, these systems are going to keep on ticking. So what am I talking about when I say institutions? I'll give you some examples. Historical institutions, slavery, sharecropping, racial violence, lynching. Now, a lot, they're like, oh my gosh, this is so long ago. Are we really going back to slavery? We'll talk about that. Jim Crow. That was actually not that long ago, folks. Talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. It feels like it was a long time ago. It was not. Redlining, blockbusting, housing discrimination. That's still going on today. And all of these things that are still going on today. Discriminatory social policy, educational inequality, mass incarceration, employment discrimination. We're going to talk a little bit about these things. And then I have to stop, because we only have so much time. I teach an entire course on these things. And at the end of the 15 weeks, we've still barely scratched the surface. It's long and deep, the past and the present around these issues, right? But let's get into it. Slavery, oh, so long ago. That was a really long time ago. Folks, do we have any history majors in the room? Raise your hand for a history major. Oh my gosh, see, this is the problem. We don't fully appreciate the value of history.
Are there any?
There's one. I think I saw one, yeah. The past is, yeah, shout out to the history major.
Yeah.
The past is prologue, folks.
Yeah.
It's not just the past. We might like it to be the past because it's easier then. We don't have to confront it. Now, if we just think about the kind of, there's tons of debates on this, I should say that. Thinking around the kind of ways in which slavery was a basis for catapulting American capitalism and allowing and enabling America to become the richest country in the history of the world, right? And there are many people who argue, not everybody agrees, but there's evidence to suggest, and there are many people who argue that America wouldn't have been able to gain the economic prominence that it gained without slavery, right? If you look at the US economy, and I have here some figures from the UK, France, and then I split up South and North and South, right? I mean, look at that huge chunk of the Southern economy that's accounted for, of the national wealth, that's accounted for via slaves, enslaved people, rather. It's huge. And for the United States in particular, it was a primary driver of our economy. Okay, that was a long time ago. But the way that economies work, it's very similar to what I talked about before. Like, what happened in the past matters now, right? It affects opportunities that we have now. But let's think about this in more detail. There's great research. These are just snippets from different studies that are interesting, but there are many more, that focuses on thinking about linkages between slavery and the present, right? And understanding, for example, if you look at the places where slavery was most intense, and it was most dense, where you had the most slaves per county or per capita or what have you, and in a particular time, in the early 1800s, ooh, that was pleasant. At least it was pleasant. It was like, you know, sometimes it's like, oh, let's all leave the room. It's on fire. You know, if you look at those places, and so we know what they look like then, and we look at them now, it looks like there's continuity in terms of the depth of inequality. So those are the places where there's the most educational inequality, the most economic inequality. Now the task for social scientists is to sort out the causal linkages there and understand what leads from one to the other. But even without having sorted through all that, we know that the legacy of slavery continues to play a role in many places in terms of the economic status of the place and the levels of economic inequality there. It also matters politically. This is a great book recently published by a few fellow political scientists when they look at how slavery still shapes Southern politics. And they can look at political attitudes and political behavior in places in the South that were really dense in terms of slave labor versus places that were not, and those places still look really different politically, right? So the past really is prologue, and talking about slavery may seem really far away, but it's not, right? Same thing with racial violence, with lynching. So reporter Jamila had this great piece a few years back in The Nation about violence and economic mobility in the Jim Crow South, and he essentially made the argument that plenty of people have made before, that one of the primary functions of lynching was as a form not just of social control, that's what it was about to make sure that black people were only looking at, interacting with, dating, engaging with black people. That's where they belong, right? So it had a social control function, but also an economic function, to make sure that you stayed in your place economically. And a lot of the places where we see the most devastating racial mobs break out, where hundreds of black people are being lynched and killed, they're the places where black people started to be mobile economically, where they started to own businesses and they started to be doing well. And often the reaction to that was, we're just gonna get rid of you. This is unacceptable, right? There's this great, it's not really great, it's horrible, it's sad, all of this is, right? Example from a grocery store. This is in Memphis, Tennessee. It's a really well-known case, People's Grocery. People's Grocery was opened by 3 black men. This is 2 of them here, a rendering of them. Thomas Moss, Calvin McDonald, and Will Stewart. They opened a grocery store in Memphis in 1842, somewhere around there. I don't remember the exact date. And it's doing well. And it's doing well largely because there are a lot of black people in Memphis at this time, and they're going to the black grocery store, right? Where they're not being gouged in terms of prices, and where they feel more comfortable. And so this starts to be a strain on the business of the other people in town who had a grocery store before these folks opened theirs up. And what happened? Capitalism, we let the market decide? Is that what happened? No, that's not what happened. What happened was, and there's a memorial to it now if you go to Memphis, Tennessee, is that the grocers across town went to the People's Grocery and they started firing with shotguns into the store in the middle of the day. Thomas Moss and Calvin McDowell were armed because it was Memphis in the 1840s. They knew what was coming, and they fired back. They didn't hit anyone, they didn't kill anyone, they didn't harm anyone, they defended themselves. But they were black men in the 1840s. So the police came and arrested them later that day, but they didn't have a chance to stand trial. Because before there was any trial, they were dragged out of that prison with police officials fully aware, and they were lynched in the street. As an example, for any other black people who thought that maybe they want to try to be economically mobile. Now, their children may have been able to have the benefit of their fathers having a successful business, right? That might have been wealth that they could have passed down to their family, and that then their children could have passed down to their children, and so on and so forth. This isn't a story that was so long ago that it's irrelevant. This is an example of how you stop the development of economic mobility and the growth of wealth in particular communities. And you do it in a lot of different ways. You do it through discrimination that occurs through the market and through social relations, but you also do it through crass, lethal violence. That's what lynching was, right? Redlining. This is a more subtle way, right? The Homeowners Loan Corporation. This is a federal program established during the Great Depression. Why? To strengthen the housing market. To make sure that even during times of economic peril, people had a chance at the American dream. They could get a home, right? They could work hard, they could save their money, they could get a loan. And the federal government was going to subsidize the American dream. But they were only going to subsidize it for people who were white. And they literally drew up maps. And the red areas are places that are a no-go. They're a no-go. 4th grade. And why are they a no-go? That's where the black and brown people are. And we will not give you a home loan if you want to live in those places. We'll only give you a home loan if you will live in the places where white people are. It means that the federal government subsidized racial residential segregation, which is still going on now, and in many places it's just as bad as it ever was in the 1960s or worse. But it also means that they want the federal government stymied the ability for black people and other people of color to actually access the primary form of wealth generation at this time, which was home ownership. So my great-grandparents, they couldn't own a home. What does that mean? When it was time for my grandparents to try to get a home, there was no wealth in the family. There was no one who could lend them money. And so on and so forth, right? And actually, that wasn't the case in my family because my parents are immigrants, but I'm giving you an example, right? Even though there were other things going on with my parents. And then it's worth pointing out the continuity here, right? In 2006, this is at the height of the housing boom, right before the crash. Black and Hispanic families making more than $200,000 a year, these are pretty wealthy people, are more likely on average to be given a subprime loan than a white family making less than $30,000 a year. This is holding constant their credit scores. It's not because you have bad credit. It's not because you didn't work hard. It's not because you didn't garner the resources necessary. You're still getting subprime loans, right? Blacks are 2.8 times more likely to be denied a loan, Latinos twice as likely, and even when approved, blacks and Latinos are more likely to receive a subprime loan than white applicants. This is just based on race. We can control for a ton of other things. And actually, the higher up the income ladder you go, the wider this disparity grows. So even African Americans and Latinos who are working really hard and supposedly achieving the American dream are much more likely to end up in a precarious economic situation. What happens when the housing crisis hits? All of those subprime loans are now really not working in your favor, and we see a tremendous loss of black wealth. There's not that much of it to begin with, and then it gets eroded. Not because people made bad decisions, but because of institutions, because lenders decided that they were going to treat people differently based on race. This has profound multi-generational consequences. What happens when you live in a bad neighborhood? When your parents can't get a loan that's not subprime. They can't get a loan in a good neighborhood. That has consequences for your whole life. If we look at kids born between 1965 and 1970 and the neighborhoods they grew up in, and we compare that across races, you just see so many more black people growing up in medium poverty and high poverty neighborhoods, and relatively few whites, right? Well, what does this mean, right? It means that you have to deal with things like violence, which affect you emotionally, psychologically going forward, affect your ability to be able to be economically mobile and live the good life, right? Even just how you feel, right? This is a survey. If you ask people during the last month how often you've been bothered, feeling down, depressed, or hopeless, it actually varies by how distressed the neighborhood you live in, and varies across race. This is affecting people in every way you can imagine. And it's just like, well, work hard, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, even though you are embedded in institutions that are actively making it difficult for you to do that, right? Let's think about employment. I'm coming down the home stretch here, folks, trust me. Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? We're not going to discriminate in the realm of employment, and we don't like to think labor market institutions, this is going to be an equalizing force. I can work hard and get a good job. And once I do that, I'm gonna make it, you know? And if anything, don't people of color have an advantage because they're getting affirmative action? They have an advantage in the labor market, right? Not so much. Because we have oodles and oodles of evidence about labor market discrimination. One of my favorite studies that my students always enjoy is from the late Diva Pager, who was a sociologist at Harvard, and she did this great study called Discrimination in the Low Wage Labor Market, even though similar work has been done looking at higher wage labor or higher income labor markets. And they go to New York City, and they actually send out real people who they call testers to apply for low wage positions. They train these testers. I think there are 6 of them, 2 black, 2 Latino, 2 white. They pick people so that they're the same height, same body type. They all have the same low haircut. They train them to behave the same, to act the same way in an interview. Because you remember for a long time, maybe you don't remember, but for a long time the argument was, It's about soft skills and social capital. People are going into the interview and they're slouching and that's why black people aren't getting jobs, because they're on the interview like acting like that, and nobody's hiring them. It's their fault. It's their fault. That's not discrimination. That's like an employer making a reasonable, rational decision. So they train these folks to behave the exact same way. Their resumes, all the same. And they send them to apply for the exact same jobs. They're measurable, similar in every measurable way. Well-spoken, clean-cut, all the things you want, ostensibly. And they have identical resumes. What happens? Do they all have the same opportunities to get these jobs? No. Black applicants had to search twice as long as equally qualified white applicants before receiving a callback or a job offer. A white person with a felony criminal record had a better chance of getting a job than a black person with no criminal record. I don't actually think we should discriminate against people based on their criminal record, so I'm not so mad at that, but it's instructive, right? This is not a one-off study. There's so much evidence. It's not an aberration. There's another great study by some economists. Are Emily and Gray more employable than Lakeisha and Jamal? The answer is yes, and we know how much more employable, about 50% more employable. All they did was change the names at the top of the resumes. Everything else was the same. Everything else was the same. It doesn't matter how hard Lakeisha works or how smart she is. And affirmative action doesn't seem to be saving her. Is it something she's doing wrong? Is she walking with a limp? Is she talking in slang? No. No. And there's so much more. Too much for me to go into today. These are called audit studies. You got into the real world, and you see what happens when you equalize everything else except one thing, your zip code, your race, etc. And audit studies have identified racial discrimination way beyond employment. In housing, you send in two couples looking to buy a house, same credit record, same income, same everything. Guess who gets the better loan? Guess where the real estate agents take the black couple versus where they take the white? Not to the same neighborhoods. They don't show them the same houses. Car sales, medical care, hailing a taxi. I'm so grateful for Uber. Even though I have issues with its business model. So many sources of frustration. I can't keep going. Race and educational inequality, right? This is about preschoolers being suspended. I worked on a project in New York State looking at why so many preschool black and Latino children, 3-year-olds being expelled from pre-K for throwing a tantrum. I have kids, and that's as ridiculous as it sounds, right? Incarceration. 1 in 3 black men. 1 in 18 black women. Despite the fact that there's no evidence to suggest that black people have a higher proclivity for committing crimes. It is institutional. It's not about individual people and their bad behavior. But the point is that these disadvantages are cumulative. If it was just mass incarceration, if it was just educational inequality, if it was just the housing market, if it was just, but it's all of these different areas. Every side that you're hemmed in on. The thing that's amazing in this country is how much progress we've managed to make despite these institutional barriers that continue to exist, right? And I want to end with a few important observations. This affects our social relations. It affects how we talk to, interact with each other. Because a lot of the black people in the room, even if they didn't know these statistics, know this stuff. They feel it. And so when something happens that seems relatively minor to you, and it's like, why are they getting so offended? It's not a big deal. I just said I like your hair, whatever. Outside of the context where you're actually having to face these kinds of barriers in your life all the time, it seems overblown. It affects our ability to understand each other, to make sense of each other, right? So when so many African Americans are saying they've experienced discrimination, right? Well, many more African Americans are also saying that they don't trust their neighbors. That they don't trust their neighbors. It affects our social relations, right? And when blacks and Hispanics say that they don't trust police officers, and we're like, oh, this Black Lives Matter stuff, police officers are good, hardworking people, sure. But there's actually some context there that might help us to understand why people feel differently about these institutions, right? People, doctors and medical officials. Now, I don't trust the cops. I don't trust my neighbors. I don't trust doctors. I don't trust the government. I'm living in a different world than you are. You're not you, right? I'm being facetious here in a way, but to say people are living in different worlds, even though they're existing in the same communities. That affects the way we engage each other socially. It affects our democracy, right? Whether we think there's any hope for true racial equality. Some of us think, hey, there's no hope for true racial equality. Some of us say, we're paying too much attention to race. All this whining and moaning about race. And we have completely different views on things like our political leaders, right? These are attitudes towards the president, President Trump. So we're existing in the same spaces, in the same institutions often, but we're actually living in very different worlds. Politically, socially, economically. The question is, what's the path forward? And you notice I left this for the end because I can't answer the question. There's really no good answer to the question. But there are good things to think about, right? First is how crucial it is to listen. So when somebody says something and it feels like they're oversensitive or feels like they're drawing conclusions, to actually try to listen and understand context, understand why people might react to things differently than you would, right? To learn. If you feel like the vast majority of things here were new for you, then there's a lot to learn. And until you learn some of that, it is going to be hard to engage, right? But engage we must. Actually have these conversations and take them beyond rooms like this, into our lives, into our dorm rooms, into our jobs, examine our social relations, and actually think, yes, institutions are doing this work. I'm a part of all kinds of institutions. What does that mean? And then change. It's totally possible, but it's not easy. And it's going to take work, right? So I hope that we all are open and committed to that kind of work going forward. I'm going to stop.
You've done it. You've laid the groundwork for us. So let's spend about 15 more minutes with questions. What's on your minds? Please, and again, just to remind you, if you'd introduce yourself, stand up at the microphone. We are recording, folks. So
no pressure at all.
Yeah.
I'm Natalie, and I just want to know, how do you think our Constitution and founding documents continue to affect our present-day institutionally racist society?
Oh, that's a good one. I mean, one of the things that's key about the Constitution is that a lot of the way that the Constitution was constructed was a pretty explicit effort to avoid dealing with the most difficult of these issues, right? It was really clear to the framers, the founders, however it is you think about those men, that slavery was going to be an issue, and that race was going to be an issue. The slide I showed you, look at how much of the Southern economy, I mean, it was over time, so some of that is averaged in that slide, but so much of the Southern economy is contingent on slave labor. So little of the Northern economy is. Everyone knows from the start this is going to be an issue, right? And so they construct a document that allows them to evade that issue. And that means that the Constitution has this kind of flexibility. It can be used to, the Constitution can absorb white supremacy and racism. It can be used to justify those things. It can also be used and has been used to justify equality, right? So it doesn't give us the solution. It gives us a framework that was actually about avoiding these issues. And so as we confront them, it's not to say that the Constitution isn't deeply important, but it can only take us so far, right? It can only take us so far. That's a great question, though. Any other brave souls, now that you've been reminded, you will be videoed. You have to stand up, hold the microphone, and say your name. Ah! Nightmare scenario. Yes, up there. Oh, I'll wait for you to get the microphone.
I'm Ben.
Hi,
Chris,
Ben.
what are your thoughts on reparations?
Oh, wow, you all aren't holding any punches. What are my thoughts on reparations? My thoughts are that I think reparations would be great. I get that it's politically difficult. I get why. I think that I try to understand the logic of, I would be paying taxes, like I'm channeling, I always tell my students, I'm channeling, right? So say I'm channeling and I am like the average white person in the US. How do I feel about paying taxes for reparations? Even if I think all of this stuff is really bad, I'm not actively doing it. I'm not perpetrating any of these things as far as I know, but I would bear the burden of accounting for them, right? So I could see that being hard. But you know, that's the way societies work. That's the way politics work. Even if I don't have kids, I pay for the local schools. Even if I don't have a car, I pay for the roads to be paved. And I benefit from living someplace that has good schools and roads paved. It means that my housing prices will go up. In the same way, even if you aren't actively, consciously participating in any of this, right? Even if, in fact, you're trying to do the opposite, you still benefit from a system where literally walking into the room, you're going to be received differently, right? So my husband is white, and we always joke about this because he will like be offered jobs he didn't even apply for and has like no qualifications for. Do you want to work for us? And for years we've joked like, wow, just everyone everywhere wants you working for them. You walk in the door and they're like, oh, look at this. And him and my brother always joke, where my brother's like, can you use my resume, go apply for a job, and then I show up on the first day? If only we could. You better bet when we were buying our house, buying a car, he is the face. He is the face. I'm like, look, let me tell you something. I'm going to benefit from this. And we see the difference. Absolutely. It makes it so palpable in our lives. There are restaurants I've gone to without him, and then I go with him, and I'm treated completely differently. Just by proximity. Now, is he some evil, horrible racist who should be paying for reparations? Like, obviously I don't think he is, or else I wouldn't have been married to him for 15 years. But you know what? He could pay some more taxes. Look, I know some of you probably hate this, but you asked. He's benefiting from the system, even if he's a good person who's actually working to undermine it. And so everybody pays for reparations because one way or the other, we're all implicated in this system. Now, I don't think reparations is going to happen. I think it's a political live wire. And so I don't have much hope for it. But if you ask my personal opinion on it, absolutely. And I will say this, knowing I probably wouldn't benefit, because a lot of the plans on the table for reparations right now are about what people call ADOS, right? Descendants of American descendants of slaves, or whatever, descendants of American slavery. I always forget the acronym. And my parents are immigrants. So I'm actually a descendant of British slavery, but not American slavery. So I'm not saying this because I'm going to get a check in the mail, right? I'm good. I'm saying this because I think it's the right thing. And you can disagree. I always tell my students this. I can think something is the right thing, and you can think it's the profoundly wrong thing, and we can still exist and try to understand why one person thinks the one thing and the other thinks the other without demonizing or hating each other, right? Mm-hmm. So you might be not on Twitter like, she said reparations. Hashtag, I hate her. But we don't have to do it like that. Anyone else? Brave souls. Mm-hmm. I see one right there.
Hi, I'm Charlotte. So during your talk, you consider Black people as a unified group, and I was wondering if those issues affect Black Americans and Black immigrants differently.
That's a great question. And it's what I think about all the time, because my parents are immigrants, but I was born here. I remember growing up and my parents, there were entire things we didn't watch on TV. Because my parents had this idea in their mind, a really pretty stereotypical idea about what Black Americans were like. You know, it's like boys in the hood, all of that ridiculousness. And I grew up in Queens, so it's like Coming to America, you know. Oh, you guys don't know. Don't you? Oh, go watch Coming to America. Come on, folks. Eddie Murphy, don't sleep on him. Murphy, what's going on in the world? That's more hopeless than any of the stuff that I was putting on. You don't know what I'm talking about. No, but seriously, you know, they would say, no, we don't want you watching that stuff on TV. We don't want you to be like these Black Americans. And they had really internalized all the negative stereotypes about, and we didn't talk about any of this stuff growing up. They don't want to hear that. Go to school, work hard, no excuses, right? Now, it worked out for me. Not so much, I have 3 older brothers, and not so much for them. They're still in the same neighborhood we grew up with, in struggling with a lot of the things on this slide. And I'm the anomaly in my family, and also the person who pays for everything. Which is another thing about wealth. Right? So even when you're economically mobile, but you're connected to communities where hardly anyone else is, guess what? You're not generating wealth in the same way. My grandmother died a few weeks ago, and if somebody in my family dies, I know nobody can pay for the funeral. It's gonna be me, right? If somebody ends up in jail, my brother was at Rikers a few years ago, I'm paying the bail. That's just the way that goes. And so sometimes my colleagues, they'll be like, oh, we're going to, I had a colleague who said, we're going to go to Egypt and blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh yeah, we're going to drive to Georgia and take a road trip. And it's like, do you guys ever travel abroad? And I'm like, I'd love to. I'd spend my money on other things. Anyway, I digress. The question about, so it's absolutely an important question. The larger picture is this. I've talked about Black people, and actually conflated Black and African American, which aren't the same thing, right? As though they're one homogenous unit, and they're not. There's all kinds of heterogeneity in there, and that heterogeneity matters. There's class heterogeneity. Not all Black people are poor and living in the hood and blah, 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 right? Disproportionately they are, but there's lots of heterogeneity in terms of class, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity, right? What country you're from. That matters. It affects the way that Black people work together in coalition with each other in the United States. And it affects the ways that policies shape their communities, right? So it's absolutely important. You know, political scientists have identified this phenomenon called linked fate that really operates in a way in the Black community, and the idea of linked fate is the belief that Black people have, and this is across ethnicity, right? That Black people in the US have, that what happens to any given Black person is related to what happens to me, right? And so my parents came to this country not having much linked fate. They came to this country buying into the American dream. We're gonna work hard, we're gonna give our children opportunity, and they worked hard. They didn't actually experience that much economic mobility in their own lives, but they hold on to me. They're like, oh, something happened. But they developed a very different sense of themselves as Black people than they had coming here. My mom always says, the first 10 years I lived in this country, I didn't think I was a Black person. And then, after the 50th time your father got pulled over by the cops, I was like, we Black. We Black. And after I sent in a job application, my mom has a story, she's applying to work in retail, nothing fancy. And she has a friend who she met at her last job, who she mentioned that she was applying to the job to, a white woman, who then went and applied for the job and got it. And my mom's like, well, I have more experience than her. And so eventually you learn, you know what, we all in this together. Yes, I'm from Trinidad and you grew up in the US, but we're being affected by these same institutional processes that frankly don't always discriminate based on whether you're a native born US person or not. At the same time, it's worth pointing out that the generational factors that I pointed out mean that people who are native born, who have been in this country generation after generation after generation, are bearing the heaviest brunt of white supremacy and American racism. So I don't want to flatten the differentiation. There are some things that all Black people, all people with Black and I would say brown skin in this country, there are some burdens that all of them are bearing, right? And then there are more or less burdens layered on based on your history, because history is really important here, right? I see a question right there. I have no idea. I'm terrible with time, so I apologize. Somebody will just.
One or two more, 5 more minutes. I know people have things they have to do.
My name is Audra. So you were talking about strengthening democracy, and my question is on, I feel like when we talk about race, it's kind of always like the same people are willing to like have discussions. Maybe sometimes there's more newer people, but how do you engage with people who are not even willing to listen up or even take that first step? And how do we move on to strengthen democracy when we have problems with, people who are not willing to really engage with you or talk to you about, have conversations like that?
Such a good question. It's a hard one, but I mean, part of this is like, I literally have no choice, right? So I teach this course on public policy, and in any given semester, I have 150 students enrolled in that class. And most of the students did not come to that class to talk about race. If you signed up for a public policy class, you probably go to the class not prepared to talk about race. But because I teach the class, and I care about the things I care about, we do all the classic public policy stuff, and then all our case studies are like race and poverty, race and poverty, race and poverty. So in my course evaluations, year after year, I'll get students to say, this was a bait and switch. I came to learn about public policy and she kept talking about race. She's just obsessed with it. So obsessed. For obvious reasons, right? This is that they say this. For obvious reasons, Professor Michener is obsessed with race. And I try to get across in the course that the obvious reason isn't because I'm black. The obvious reason is because it's such a foundational part of public policy in the US. And this is what I find. By the end of the semester, I have 3 categories of students. Students who already came into the class believing that. And I've just given them a basis, like an empirical basis for understanding why, how, mechanisms, processes, history. They've just layered on more knowledge. Students who came into the class not really thinking about it, having no idea. And now I've given them something to think about. They might not leave and I don't want, my goal is not to make my students leave the class thinking how I think, right? We should all be thinking differently, and that actually enriches a classroom in the world, right? But when it comes to understanding empirical reality, I do want all of us to be on the same page about that. But some of them leave not having thought about these empirical realities, not having contended with them, living in a world where you didn't have to. Guess what? I have students say to me, I grew up in a nice house, in a nice suburb, with parents who I never had to think about money. I never had to think about anything. And there were hardly any people of color around. Everybody was happy and everything was fine. And I don't begrudge anybody that life. It sounds wonderful. But then you show up in my class and it's like, I'm making you think about all these uncomfortable things. And there are some students who are like, wow, okay, now I have to think about this. And so they're thinking more than they were before. That's a victory. Then there's always a relatively small group who don't want to hear it. They don't want to hear it. I can feel the disgust and disdain when I read the evaluations. They just hate the fact that I've even tried to make them think about these things. And they dislike me for it. So that is a microcosm of the broader world, and this is how I approach this. The people who are on board, I want to make common cause with them. The people who are questioning, I want to engage them and help them to think deeply, more thoroughly, in a way that reflects a wider variety of perspectives. The people who are the hardliners who want nothing to do with it, I do not have the mental and emotional energy for them. I hope somebody does. I'm not saying we throw them out, that they don't matter, that they're not people. They're a part of our political community. And the decisions they make around voting, around how they engage the world, affect us. Those folks, and I think it's a relatively small group, still matter. But I do not have the energy to give them. I'm too busy fighting all the things on these slides. But I do hope that there are other people, maybe some of the people in that middle category who learn, who can then go and reach those folks, right? But you can't single-handedly get people who don't want to be on board. And we sort of lament preaching to the choir. I think you preach to the choir, it strengthens the choir, and maybe you get a couple of people at the margins who become aware, and you expand that from there. It's not the answer, but it's the best I know to do.
Can I put in a quick plug there for my little silly box, what next, right? In our community, Carrie and I want to think about how we can better listen, engage, change, and partner with others who are working on this at Colby. So if on your way out, you just drop either you have a piece of paper and you write your name and your email, or a couple of papers in here, we can put together a working group and figure out who else we can have come to visit us, what we can do as a community. So I really hope that we understand, and I know Dr. Michener came here because we told her this was not a one-off.
Yeah.
Right? This wasn't convenient getting here from Ithaca, but as a process we're beginning. So I hope that many of you are willing to do that.
And if you're thinking like, well, this isn't my thing, I don't know anything about this, or this doesn't really have anything to do with my life, or I've never really thought about this before, and I don't have to, I can just go back to my life and everything's fine, then you're exactly among the folks who should be a part of it. Because you want the choir in the room, you want the people who know it deeply, who experience it, who feel it in their bones, and you also want the people who feel like, I'm not sure this is really relevant to me. That can be a really powerful convergence.
So I had said there could be one more question. Is there one more sitting out here that, no, you put
Last chance,
Last
no
chance.
pressure. Oh,
double down.
glutton for punishment.
I'm wondering this seems a little daunting as an 18-year-old white kid. What can one do other than go into politics and change laws? What can one do when such a big problem is so foundational?
Yeah, okay, so first, go into politics. I'm a political scientist. So I just want to say the caveat should not be a caveat. Second, a couple of different things. You know, one is recognizing that these forces are operating in multiple institutions. Even if you don't go into politics, you're going to go into something, right? You're going to be a lawyer at a law firm. You're going to be a doctor in a hospital. You're going to work in a nonprofit. If you're at Colby, it means you're really smart and you're on an upward trajectory. It means even now on campus, you're probably in positions of leadership. You're probably in a club, right? And you'll continue to be there. You'll have opportunities. You'll have opportunities to be like, I'm colorblind, I don't see race. Or to be like, what are the dynamics in this room? Who's talking? Who's taking up all the space? Whose voice is being heard? Who's being respected? I notice this in my grad seminars all the time. And it works with gender just as well as it does with race. Like, a woman will say something and we all move on. A man says something and we're talking about it for the next 30 minutes. And it happens week after week after week after week. Whose voice is being heard? When you notice that, when you don't notice that, you're just the dude who benefits from it. Right? It doesn't mean you're a bad person. It doesn't mean you're doing it on purpose. There's no indictment of you. But when you notice it, you can undermine it. You can say, you know what? I am in this room, and there's 3 black students in this class, and I never hear their voices. I know all about what I think and what the other people in this class who seem to think and look like me think, but I don't know what anyone else thinks. Maybe I can talk less. Maybe I can take up less space. Or maybe I can take up a different kind of space. I can engage in a different kind of way, right? It's not to say you just have to shrink back and not exist. That's not the idea. But you think about what you're bringing to every space you're in a leadership position. You all are going to be the people who go out into the world and have power. It's not true that there's nothing that you can do. It's a lie. And, you know, this stuff can be daunting, and then it's like, oh, throw your hands up in the air. It's been happening for hundreds of years. What do we do? It's institutional, so there's limits to what an individual can do, but there's still a lot to work with. And it starts now. It starts now. If you start to interrogate your social interactions and relationships, the way that you engage and interact in a classroom, the way that you think about people and feel. You're watching the news or you're hearing students, you know, talk about issues. There's all sorts of ways that you will start to catch yourself. I catch myself all the time. And often not around issues of race, but other things where I feel like I'm not, you know, with, for example, issues of sexuality where, hey, like as a heterosexual person, that's just not something that's on my radar. And once it gets on my radar, I'm like, oh, wait a minute. I'm doing some stuff I could do differently. And that's the position that most of you in the room are in. Are you a bad person? Am I saying that you're racist and you're blah, blah, blah? No. That is fodder for distraction and deflection. Put that out of your mind. I'm not saying you're anything. I don't know you. But we're all a part of this system, and we can all be a part of undermining and dismantling it. Absolutely everyone in the room. Anyway, good question. Ben, is it?
hearts and minds in the room. Thank you all for coming. And that silly little box, if you can drop your name and email in it, we'll
Put your name
try to
in the
partner and
box.
move around.